You don't belong here, ma'am. This is a military ceremony, not a public park. The voice was sharp, authoritative, and carried the weight of a man accustomed to instant obedience. It cut through the crisp morning air of the parade ground like a blade. Major Richard Collins, a career officer with a chest full of peacetime ribbons and a face that had never seen combat, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his dress uniform immaculate. He stared down at the woman, standing quietly at the edge of the formation. Morgan Reese, 44 years old, stood perfectly still. She wore simple civilian clothes, faded jeans, a worn denim jacket with a faded patch on the left breast, and scuffed boots. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn on their morning walk, but her posture was unmistakable. Shoulders back, chin level, feet shoulder-width apart. It was the posture of someone who had stood at attention 1,000 times before. She said nothing. Her eyes, clear and gray as winter steel, were fixed on the formation of young soldiers, standing in perfect rows before her. They were preparing for a change of command ceremony, a formal military tradition, marking the transfer of authority from one commanding officer to another. Behind them, the American flag hung motionless in the still morning air. The parade ground was immaculate, the grass trimmed to regulation height, the white painted lines marking formation positions, sharp and fresh. "Ma'am," Major Collins repeated, stepping closer, his voice rising with impatience. "I asked you a question. This is a restricted area, authorized personnel only. You need to leave. Now!" Morgan slowly turned her gaze from the soldiers to the major. Her expression was calm, almost serene. "I was invited," she said, her voice low and even, "by the outgoing commander." Major Collins let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Invited? By Colonel Hayes." He looked her up and down with undisguised contempt, taking in her casual clothes, her worn boots, her simple ponytail. "I find that very hard to believe. Colonel Hayes doesn't invite civilians to official ceremonies, especially not." He paused, searching for the right word, his lips curling slightly. "People who look like they just wandered off the street." A few of the younger officers standing nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. They could sense the brewing confrontation, but none dared to intervene. Major Collins was the executive officer, the second in command, and his word was law. He had a reputation for being a stickler for protocol, for running a tight ship, and for not tolerating anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of military order. The small gallery of family members and guests assembled on folding chairs near the reviewing stand shifted uncomfortably. They had come to watch their loved ones participate in the ceremony, and now they were witnessing what appeared to be an altercation. "This is a solemn military tradition," Collins continued, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured broadly at the formation, at the podium draped with the unit colors, at the reviewing stand where senior officers would soon be seated. "We honor the chain of command. We honor the institution. We honor those who have served with distinction. We don't invite random civilians to gawk at our formations like it's some kind of street parade." Morgan didn't respond. She simply looked past him, her gaze returning to the soldiers. Many of them were young, barely out of their teens. Fresh faces, nervous energy barely contained beneath their rigid postures. They stood ramrod straight in their dress uniforms, their shoes polished to a mirror shine, their faces serious and focused. She had been their age once, a lifetime ago. She remembered standing in a formation just like this, her heart pounding, trying not to fidget, trying to embody everything she thought a soldier should be. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Collins said, his patience exhausted. His face was beginning to redden, his jaw tight. "Leave, or I will have the military police escort you off this base, and I can assure you that will not be a pleasant experience." "I have a pass," Morgan said quietly, reaching into her jacket pocket with slow, deliberate movements. Collins snatched the laminated card from her hand before she could fully extend it, his fingers closing around it with unnecessary force. He squinted at it, his face reddening further as he read. "This is a visitor pass," he said, his voice rising. "It grants you access to the base. It doesn't grant you access to a restricted ceremony. Do you understand the difference? He thrust it back at her, the card fluttering in the air before landing at her feet. "You're out of your depth, ma'am. This isn't a place for sightseers. This isn't a zoo. These are the finest soldiers in the United States Army, and they deserve better than to have some confused civilian wandering around their ceremony." He turned to a young sergeant standing nearby, a man with a respectful demeanor and an uncomfortable expression on his face. "Sergeant Davis, escort this woman to the main gate. Immediately." The sergeant, a young man no more than 25 with kind eyes and a hesitant posture, took a step forward but paused. Something about the woman's bearing made him uneasy. She didn't look confused. She didn't look lost. She looked certain. There was something in her eyes, a depth, a stillness that reminded him of the old combat veterans he'd met at VA hospitals during volunteer work. "Sir," the sergeant began, his voice uncertain, "maybe we should—" "Now, Sergeant," Collins snapped, his voice sharp as a whip. "That's an order. I don't have time for hesitation. Remove her from the area." The sergeant reluctantly moved toward Morgan, his hand hovering near her elbow but not quite touching. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to come with me." Morgan looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of sad understanding. She had seen this before. Young soldiers following orders, even when their instincts told them something was wrong. "It's all right, son," she said softly. "You're just doing your job." About 50 yards away, standing in the command tent reviewing the ceremony schedule and checking last-minute details, Colonel Rebecca Hayes, the outgoing commander, glanced at her watch. The ceremony was set to begin in 10 minutes. Everything had to be perfect. This was her final act of leadership for this command, her formal goodbye to the soldiers she had led for the past 2 years. Her aide, a sharp young lieutenant named Parker, with an impeccable service record, stepped into the tent, his face pale, his normally composed demeanor cracked. "Ma'am," Parker said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm, "we have a situation on the parade ground." Colonel Hayes looked up from the ceremony program, her brow furrowing. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, her uniform pressed to perfection, her graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She had served for 28 years, seen combat in 2 wars, and commanded soldiers in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Very little rattled her. "What kind of situation?" she asked, her voice calm but alert. "Major Collins he's removing someone from the ceremony, a civilian woman. He's calling her a trespasser. He's having her escorted off the parade ground." Hayes's eyes narrowed. "A civilian woman? What does she look like?" Parker consulted his mental notes, his words coming quickly. Mid-40s, jeans, denim jacket, brown hair pulled back. She's not arguing. She's just standing there, very calm. But the major's making a scene. The colonel's face went pale. Her pen clattered to the table. She stood so quickly her chair toppled backward with a crash. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice suddenly hoarse. "That's her." She was out of the tent before Parker could respond, moving at a near run across the parade ground, her polished shoes pounding against the grass, her dress uniform coat flapping behind her. Parker scrambled to follow, confused but alarmed by the colonel's sudden panic. Back at the formation, Sergeant Davis had reluctantly placed a hand on Morgan's elbow, his touch gentle, apologetic. He was preparing to guide her away from the parade ground, following his orders even though every instinct told him this was wrong. The major stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, a smug look of satisfaction on his face. He had restored order. He had protected the integrity of the ceremony. He had done his job. "This is what happens when you don't follow protocol," Collins said loudly, ensuring the nearby soldiers and guests could hear. His voice carried across the parade ground, pedagogical and self-righteous. "Civilians think they can just wander onto a military installation and insert themselves into ceremonies that have nothing to do with them. Well, not on my watch, not in my army." A few of the soldiers in formation shifted slightly, their eyes following the scene despite their training to remain motionless. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked confused. A handful, those who had bought into Collins' worldview, looked satisfied. "This is a military ceremony for military personnel," Collins continued, warming to his theme. "We honor those who have earned the right to stand here. who have sacrificed, who have served with distinction, not random civilians who... Major Collins, the voice, sharp, furious, and unmistakable, cut through his words like a gunshot. Every head turned in unison, a collective snap of necks. Colonel Hayes was striding across the parade ground, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Her normally composed features were twisted with anger, her eyes blazing. Her dress uniform gleamed in the morning sun, her medals, earned in Iraq and Afghanistan, catching the light with each purposeful step. Major Collins snapped to rigid attention, his smugness evaporating like water on a hot skillet. "Ma'am, Step away from her," Hayes commanded, her voice low and dangerous, each word enunciated with precision. "Right. Now." Collins obeyed instantly, taking 2 quick steps backward, confusion and fear flickering across his face. He had never seen the colonel like this. She was always composed, always measured, always professional. Sergeant Davis immediately released Morgan's elbow and stepped back, relief visible on his face. The colonel came to a stop directly in front of Morgan, less than 3 feet away. For a long moment, a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the 2 women simply looked at each other. A universe of shared history passed between them in that silent gaze. Morgan's calm, gray eyes meeting Hayes's furious, protective ones. Recognition, respect, something deeper than words could express. Then in a move that sent a shockwave through every soldier watching, through every guest in the gallery, through every officer standing nearby, Colonel Rebecca Hayes snapped to the sharpest, most reverent, most pristine position of attention she had ever held in her 28-year career. Her back became ramrod straight, her chin tucked perfectly, her shoulders squared, her hands rigid and precise, pressed against the seams of her trousers. Her right hand came up in a salute so crisp, so perfect, so full of reverence that it seemed to slice the morning air. Her gloved fingers touched the brim of her cap with military precision. Her arm, a rigid, unwavering line of respect. "Sergeant Major Reese," the colonel's voice rang out, clear and powerful, echoing across the silent parade ground, carrying to every corner of the formation. "It is an honor to have you here, ma'am." She held the salute, her eyes locked on Morgan's, unwavering, unblinking. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person moved. Not a single boot scraped against grass. Not a single breath was audible. Major Collins stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his mind struggling to process what was happening. His carefully constructed worldview was crumbling in real time. The young soldiers in formation, who had been trained to remain motionless, stood with their eyes wide, their minds racing. The guests in the gallery leaned forward, confused, curious, sensing they were witnessing something profound. Morgan, Sergeant Major Morgan Reese, stood perfectly still for a heartbeat longer. Then slowly, as if rousing from a long dream, she straightened her shoulders. The weariness seemed to fall away from her like a discarded coat, replaced by an echo of the soldier she had once been. Her own right hand came up, her movement deliberate, practiced, muscle memory forged over decades, and she returned the salute with precision that belied the years since she had last worn the uniform. Colonel Hayes held her salute for 3 more seconds, an eternity in military time, before slowly lowering her hand. But her eyes never left Morgan's. Only after Morgan had lowered her own hand, only after that sacred exchange was complete, did the colonel turn her head. She turned slowly, deliberately, her gaze sweeping over the formation, over the guests, over the officers, and finally landing, with the force of a physical blow, on Major Collins. He flinched as if struck. Her eyes were cold, colder than he had ever seen them. The fury there was not hot and explosive. It was glacial, controlled, and infinitely more terrifying. "Major Collins," Hayes said, her voice quiet now, but carrying more weight than if she had shouted. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" Collins opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat had gone dry. Hayes didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need one. She turned back toward Morgan, but her words were for the benefit of everyone present. The soldiers, the guests, the officers, and most especially, the arrogant fool who had just committed an unforgivable act. For those of you who don't know, Hayes began, her voice resonating with pride, with authority, with controlled fury, you are in the presence of a legend, a true American hero. She gestured toward Morgan with an outstretched hand, her movement formal, reverent. This is Sergeant Major Morgan Reese, United States Army, retired. She served for 26 years in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. 4 combat deployments, 2 to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan. Member of the 75th Ranger Regiment. A collective gasp went through the formation. Even the most junior soldiers knew what that meant. The 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the Army's most elite special operations units. The soldiers who led the way, the first in, last out. Several of the older NCOs in the formation, men who had served long enough to have heard the stories, suddenly stood even straighter, their eyes fixed on Morgan with new understanding. Sergeant Major Reese, Hayes continued, her voice growing stronger, was awarded the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. The Silver Star, third highest military decoration, awarded for valor in combat. In October 2009, outside Kandahar, Afghanistan, Sergeant Reese's unit came under ambush by a numerically superior enemy force. Their position was overrun. Communications were down. Casualties were mounting. The situation was, by any objective measure, hopeless. Hayes paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Sergeant Reese, with complete disregard for her own safety, organized the surviving soldiers, established a defensive perimeter, and led a counter-assault that drove back the enemy long enough for air support to arrive. She then coordinated the evacuation of 14 wounded soldiers under continuous enemy fire. Hayes's voice grew even more intense. During the evacuation, she carried 3 wounded soldiers, one at a time, across 200 meters of open, fire-swept terrain to the extraction point. She made that journey 3 times while taking enemy fire, while wounded herself. More gasps from the formation, from the gallery. She also holds 2 bronze stars with V device for valor, 4 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat, the Distinguished Service Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, and numerous other awards that most soldiers will never see in their entire careers. Hayes turned her attention back to Major Collins. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. Sergeant Major Reese is not a civilian wandering onto our parade ground. She is not a trespasser. She is not a confused old woman who doesn't understand protocol. Hayes stepped closer to Collins, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow still carried across the silent field. She is the reason many of us are standing here today. She is the embodiment of everything we claim to honor. She is more soldier in her worn boots than you will ever be in your perfectly pressed uniform. Collins' face had gone from red to a sickly pale white. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Ma'am, I didn't know," he stammered. "You didn't ask," Hayes shot back, her voice sharp as a blade. "You saw someone who didn't fit your narrow, superficial definition of what a soldier should look like. You saw a woman in civilian clothes. You saw someone without rank insignia, without a uniform, without a chest full of ribbons on display, and you dismissed her." Hayes's voice rose, filled with controlled rage. "You humiliated her. You treated her like a vagrant. You ordered her removed from a ceremony that she was personally invited to attend. You disrespected everything she represents, everything we claim to stand for." She stepped even closer, her face inches from his. "You, Major, have just committed one of the greatest acts of disrespect I have ever witnessed in my 28 years of service. And I have seen a lot." Collins could only nod, his voice completely gone, his throat closed with shame and fear. The formation remained frozen. The guests sat motionless. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Hayes turned to address the assembled soldiers, her voice returning to its normal command tone, though the fury still simmered beneath. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. Respect is not determined by appearance. Honor is not measured by the clothes someone wears or the age on their driver's license. The greatest heroes often walk among us unrecognized, unnoticed, unburdened by the need to prove themselves." She gestured toward Morgan. "Sergeant Major Reese doesn't need a uniform to be a soldier. She doesn't need medals on her chest to command respect. She has earned, through blood, through sacrifice, through decades of service, the right to stand anywhere she damn well pleases. Hayes turned back to Collins one final time. You will report to my office immediately following this ceremony, and you will spend the rest of your career learning what it truly means to serve with honor, what it means to respect those who came before you, what it means to judge people by their character and their actions, not by their appearance. She paused. You're dismissed from this formation, Major. Leave. Now. Collins, his career in shambles, his reputation destroyed, could only salute weakly and walk away, his steps uncertain, his head down. As he departed, Hayes turned back to Morgan, her expression softening immediately, the fury replaced by something warmer, deeper. Ma'am, I apologize on behalf of this entire command. You were invited here as my personal guest, as someone I consider a mentor and a hero. This ceremony is as much yours as it is mine. Morgan finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying across the formation, across the parade ground, settling into the hearts of everyone present. It's all right, Colonel. He didn't know. Most people don't. And that's okay. She looked at the young soldiers, their faces now filled with a mixture of awe, shame, and profound respect. The uniform doesn't make the soldier, she said, her voice gentle but firm. The heart does. The choices you make when no one is watching. The way you treat people, all people, regardless of their rank, their appearance, their background. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the formation. Respect isn't something you wear on your chest like a medal. It's something you carry inside, and it should be given freely to everyone until they prove, through their actions, that they don't deserve it. She looked directly at the young soldiers. Judge people by what they do, not by what they look like. That's the only lesson that matters. As she spoke, a memory flickered unbidden through her mind, as vivid as if it were happening again. She was 29 years old, kneeling in the sand outside a small village near Kandahar. The firefight had ended minutes ago, but the air still smelled of cordite and blood. Her uniform was torn, her face streaked with dust and sweat. Her left arm burned where shrapnel had torn through the muscle. In her arms was a young Afghan girl, no more than 7 years old, who had been caught in the crossfire between the American patrol and Taliban fighters. The girl was terrified, sobbing, her small body trembling uncontrollably. Morgan whispered to her in broken Pashto, words she had learned from the interpreters. You're safe. I've got you. You're safe. She held the girl close, shielding her with her own body, and carried her across 200 meters of open ground, still potentially hostile, to the medevac landing zone. The girl survived. Morgan never learned her name, but she remembered her eyes, the trust, the relief. That moment, not the medal ceremony months later, not the commendations, not the promotion, that was what mattered. The life, the choice to risk everything for someone who couldn't fight back. The ceremony proceeded. Morgan stood at the front of the formation, next to Colonel Hayes, in a position of honor usually reserved for distinguished guests and senior officers. When the national anthem played, she stood at perfect attention, her hand over her heart, tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed for years, finally breaking free and streaming down her weathered face. When Colonel Hayes gave her farewell speech, she mentioned Morgan by name, calling her the finest soldier I ever had the privilege to serve alongside. The applause that followed was thunderous. When the ceremony concluded, the young soldiers didn't disperse immediately. They approached Morgan one by one, offering respectful salutes and quiet words of thanks. Thank you for your service, Sergeant Major. It's an honor to meet you, ma'am. I'm sorry for what happened. Morgan shook each hand, looked each soldier in the eye, and thanked them for their own service. 2 weeks later, Major Collins, demoted and reassigned to a desk job pending his retirement, requested a meeting with Morgan. They met at a quiet coffee shop off base, a place with worn wooden tables and the smell of fresh brewed coffee. Collins looked older, smaller. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind something raw and uncertain. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his hands trembling slightly around his coffee cup. "I wanted to apologize. In person, Not because I was ordered to, not because it's the right political move, but because I was wrong. Profoundly, inexcusably wrong. Morgan looked at him over her own cup, her expression unreadable. I've spent my entire career, Collins continued, his voice breaking, thinking I understood what service meant, thinking I understood honor. But I was performing, playing a role, following a script. He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. You showed me what real honor looks like, and I'm ashamed. Morgan was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a book, a memoir written by a ranger who had served in Somalia. She pushed it across the table. Read this, she said. Understand what service really means. Not the ceremonies, not the medals, not the uniforms, the quiet moments, the choices made when no one is watching, the willingness to sacrifice everything for people you'll never meet. She paused. Then go back. Be the officer your soldiers deserve. Teach them what you learned. That's how you make this right. Collins looked at the book, then back at her, his eyes glistening. Yes, ma'am. I will. He stood to leave, then hesitated. Can I ask, why did you forgive me after what I did? Morgan smiled, a small, sad smile. Because someone once gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it, and it changed my life. Stories like Morgan Reese's remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often unnoticed, often unrecognized, often dressed in the simplest of clothes. If you believe in honoring their quiet valor, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Veterans Past Stories for more tales that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching.